Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Builders. I'm your host, Matthew Cowan, General Partner at N47. On this show, I sit down with the founders building cutting-edge products in generational companies. Today, I'm chatting with Jahan Khanna, co-founder and CEO of XBuild. Jahan is a serial entrepreneur. He first founded Shepherd Intelligent Systems. Then he co-founded Sidecar, one of the original ride-sharing pioneers, which was acquired by GM back in 2016. From there, he led product at Uber for almost 4 years. Now with XBuild, he's going after one of tech's last great frontiers, construction. XBuild just raised a $19 million Series A to build the first AI-native estimating platform for contractors. Let's get into it. Hey, Jahan, welcome to Builders.
Hey, thanks for having me, Matthew.
You co-founded Shepherd Intelligent Systems, then Sidecar, now XBuild. 3 totally different industries. What is the common thread you follow when you decide something is worth building?
The common thread to me has always been participating at the edge of what's possible technologically. So what is the emergent technology? What is what's the amazing thing you can do now that you couldn't do before? And how do you apply that at the edge?
So what do you mean by edge in this case?
Well, so to me, it's a technological disruption, and it is actually ready to be applied to a market use case. And it's very easy to be stale, right? And then you're kind of in 5 million clones every day land. And it's also kind of deceptively easy to fall into it's almost ready, but it's not quite. And actually, the journey to getting the technological disruption ready seems very close, but is perhaps 24 or 36 months away, something like this. And so on both sides, there's a trap, and it's kind of an art, but a lot of luck, a lot of persistence to figure out how to land in the right place.
Yeah, autonomous driving seems like one of those clear examples where it always felt like it was just tomorrow, and maybe now it is actually happening.
That's a perfect example. Now, I would say Google deserves a hell of a lot of credit for they just didn't care, right? They were just going to keep doing it forever until it worked. Most people, you can't do that. So, yeah.
Back to the original question, Jahan. So it sounds to me like the common threads for you are a technical challenge, doing something that wasn't possible before, married with a market opportunity.
That's kind of my taste. I think there are other people that like other things. I like using the toys,
That's fair. Now, when you left Uber, you had stability and scale, and you decided to start XBuild. Walk us through that pivot decision. What made you willing to leave to build something new at that time? Why was it the time?
Sure. I mean, Uber, I had a great time at Uber. That was an unbelievable journey. So I was basically recruited in the company by Travis Kalanick and Ed Baker and Travis Vanderzanden, who were the kind of 3 product leads and CEO at that time. And, famously, Travis left. And Dar joined, and we went through an IPO, and he also had a huge respect for Dar. I think he has done a bunch of. He was handed a very difficult situation. I think he navigated it extremely well. So he IPO'd, and at that point, my role was one of these roles. I had a large number of people reporting to me. I had product teams all over the globe, hardware and software teams. It was one of those kind of large, mega product executive corporate roles. And that was cool. That is amazing in its own way, but it stops being about building at that scale. It's much more about cultural management, about making sure each department has internal cohesion and organization and budget, of making sure that metrics are consistent across these teams. It just becomes a very different thing.
So the company got too big. It wasn't sort of an exercise of building anymore in the way that perhaps where your true passion lies.
Well, I think it's a matter of taste. Yeah, I like small teams, and I like sitting around in a garage and tinkering with stuff. That's really, to me, what what is fun about technology.
So let's drill into XBuild a little bit more specifically. I think construction is one of the last major industries that software really hasn't touched in a meaningful way. When did you feel that? Was there a specific contractor conversation or job site moment, or how did you sort of come upon that epiphany in recognizing this market opportunity?
The genesis of this is there's three co-founders at XBuild. One is my brother, Shahrukh, and he's been a civil engineer for a long time. I left Uber. I wasn't doing anything for a couple of years. So at that point, he and I started talking more about some of the stuff he was working on. And for a variety of fairly, I would say, idiosyncratic reasons, construction has adopted an extremely, extremely conservative posture, especially in the United States, to technology. It is just culturally kind of 10 years behind everything else. The reasons for that are actually kind of interesting. Like Silicon Valley is its own thing, and Silicon Valley, we kind of take it for granted. Everyone is fighting for an edge. Everyone is just fighting for an edge or optimization. If you can do something 5% better, everyone's going to pounce on that. Construction comes from the military, right? It's really an artifact of post-war GI Bill, like a lot of people leaving the military and standing up construction companies. And as a result, the culture is very much, we are not optimizing. We are conservative by default. And everyone who is in this industry has a high pain tolerance for bullshit, basically. And that's culturally what we value. That itself is actually, I think, a very interesting thing you need to understand about all these industries if you're going to sell into them. You really need to focus on mission critical problems, or you're just not going to get anywhere with these groups.
That makes sense. So thinking about that question further, your early users are roofing contractors who have estimated jobs with a spreadsheet or legal pads for years and decades. What's your advice for founders trying to find users for a product that doesn't exist yet in legacy industries? How do you sort of bridge that vision gap and thinking about approaching users that have never had access to these kinds of automations or technologies before?
I think the most constructive thing to say to begin with is it just is a very difficult problem. Everyone should just acknowledge that. You're not just going to walk in and figure it out. The discovery process itself can take a very, very long time. So my first advice is just, you have to be completely willing to just sit there and try things for a lot longer than you expect until you finally understand how these groups think. And the way they think is very different than you think. So the first crack we actually found in this thing was not just using agentic AI to estimate construction projects, but using agentic AI to estimate construction projects where there was an insurance counterparty, right? And that is like a very, very, very opaque thing to figure out. But the reason is they are fine estimating with a spreadsheet, but when they have a counterparty that isn't, and now we're starting to figure this broader ecosystem out, there's dozens and dozens of these kind of counterparties all over the industry, government rebates, environmental groups, et cetera, et cetera. When they have this counterparty, then they're held to a much higher standard on what the estimate has to be, what the paperwork has to be. And then they feel the pain because they actually can't proceed with a project until they do some extremely onerous task. So even just the first layer inside of, you can estimate with AI now, that's not enough. That's not enough to break into a lot of these industries. You really have to identify what is the true, just absolute existential pain point these guys are going to encounter on a particular job. Once you understand that, the space kind of opens up because you just find the periphery where there's second order effects to the estimate itself. And that's where the agentic wedge really works.
That makes sense. Now, XBuild is described as a vibe coding estimating platform for construction. I love that term and phrase.
Vibe estimating, yeah.
Yeah. How are you seeing vibe coding changing such a physical industry?
Vibe coding itself has been revolutionary. And the way coding has changed has been revolutionary. And there are things about coding that made it the first to kind of be disrupted in this way. I believe all forms of knowledge work really will be disrupted and replaced by a similar kind of paradigm. but each will have its own flavors. So what we've really started to understand about what we call vibe estimation is there's actually kind of two important components here. There's the person who's creating the estimate and who we want to be the endpoint, which is kind of the inspector or the person that comes to a house. You call a construction company, they send someone out. That person takes a bunch of photos and sends you a document. So usually the way the industry works is they want as many of these people to be in the field as humanly possible, and they want them to be going at full tilt. But because of the nature of construction, there's an extremely high risk of an estimator giving any one of these guys that gives the wrong proposal or a completely upside down proposal or too large a discount or gives the wrong quote on the wrong material. That can actually just take an entire company down just because of the margins on these things. So it's this combination of they're trying to really quickly give massive proposals with very thin margins and huge capital risk on each of these projects. And so what we've uncovered is you want to be able to create the estimate very fast and very effectively. The other half is you immediately want the central office to be able to tell if something strange has happened in the field with a proposal. And it's much more like vibe coding but more importantly, I need to be able to review the code immediately. It's a similar premise, but the flavor is very different. Like I think legal will have its own version of that. Design will have its own version of that. And it was very natural for the first one to be programming, but I suspect everything will follow its own paradigm once the flavor is understood.
So switching gears for a moment here, Jahan, you came up as a technical co-founder at Sidecar, and now you lead as a company as a CEO. What has the shift been for you like from CTO to CEO? And do you ever have sort of discomfort now delegating to others what you used to do yourself on the technical and CTO role?
Yes. I mean, so to be fair, I was a product executive at Uber. So I kind of got over that at Uber, but Rob, CTO co-founder at XBuild, he is an amazing engineer, right? He's an amazing architect. And he and I have technical arguments frequently, and I'm probably right 15% of the time or something, right? That's kind of my contribution. That's how I view my technical contribution. But the thing I kind of enjoy and why I operate companies in this space that are kind of very technical leaning is I think what I add as a CEO is just making sure there's a very robust and precise conversation between enormously different sets of expertise. So we have construction people that have estimated, billions and billions of dollars of projects that work in this company, and they have to sit alongside AI engineers. And this conversation has to be had, and even just understanding what the roadmap needs to look like and how the company should be organized so that what comes out the other side is like a compelling user experience, but also an accurate product. These are enormously opaque challenges. What has been rewarding is just like setting up an environment where that kind of collaboration happens. I think a very unique kind of conversation happens, a very unique kind of team emerges. That's been cool. Now, granted, I often, try to I have side vibe coded projects that I try to convince Rob to put in, but immediately when I start trying to put anything in the repository, he gets very nervous. So that's kind of where we are.
He's rejecting your contributions sometimes.
Yeah, he's rejecting my contributions. I think he'd prefer I don't even start the contribution, but but it's where we are.
Fair enough. Let's talk a little bit about the kind of product magic piece and kind of how you go about building what you build.
Sure.
What is the single product question you ask before building any new feature in a market like construction where you are, where the user's workflow is deeply habitual, and to that end, maybe you could think of an example, what separates features that really stick and get adopted and maybe one that didn't survive and ultimately had to get cut, and kind of what did you learn from that?
The question I always ask, and I don't think this is novel to me, is what is the existential problem we're solving? is there a true risk the company would go out of business if it didn't have this? And how are we making this 10 times better than the status quo? Those are kind of the two guiding principles to everything. And there needs to be a concise answer to both of those, or we don't proceed.
So clearly that definition excludes anything that's only in the nice to have category.
It excludes anything in the nice to have category, especially when it comes to these legacy industries. It's not just what is the existential problem, it's what is the existential problem and how are we making it 10 times better. If you make an existential problem twice, 2x better, that sounds good, but it still will not get adopted.
Not good enough. Now, is there an example of something you guys pushed into the product that didn't get adopted?
Yeah, all the time. So we're having an active conversation about trades to expand into next. There's a lot of interest from like very casual remodelers, and builder premise is like for very simple jobs where you actually could write something out without much risk. Should we even be wasting our time selling to these people, or should we be focused on larger projects that are, above, let's say $25 to $100,000 that have some technical components where there actually is a material problem? I suspect what's going to happen is like people who need to repair a fence or something, right? They like want to play with it, but they won't ultimately adopt this thing. They'll stick with a clipboard. Whereas, HVAC right now, we're doing a lot of work with kind of commercial solar installations, all these things. Like it needs to be an absolute train wreck if you don't have the solution.
So let's move on. So, AI products in legacy industries can miss the tacit knowledge that lives in workers' heads. This is some type of tribal knowledge you talk about. What's your advice to builders trying to capture and encode that tribal knowledge, especially in construction?
Okay, so we spent a lot of time about this. Usually the way it works is people who complain to support a lot, we try to attract them and we entice them to become development partners. And in doing so, what we offer to do is we have a lot of data analyst kind of teams. We forward deploy those guys. And ultimately what we are seeking to do is we're on a system where every 45 days, we want to make it easier and easier for the company to onboard itself and onboard what it considers its own trade secrets, its way of participating, its way of estimating, its relationships with its material providers, this kind of thing. They all have this. And right now, like as the product evolves, what we've seen is every time we make it easier to do that, our kind of revenue growth accelerates. And ultimately, we do feel within the next couple of months, it should be a fully agentic thing. And, of course, if you're beyond a certain size, we'll always do it for you, if you're in a white glove tier. But what's most important is our team talks like every single day in kind of great detail about any hallucination that has been encountered in the field by any one of these development partners. And that's a task. We do that every day. And that feeds back into the kind of highest priority of the sprint for the development team. And I don't think there's any other way to do it. There's a lot of like cool and novel architectural things we've done to solve this, but understanding what is important and understanding the minutia of what hallucinations even like really matter is something you have to get directly from the customer, especially right now. Like it gets to a point where you can't even understand. Like some customers really care about some things, some customers don't. Some things really matter. Like, for example, you're going to do a roof replacement and you have in the back of your mind that you're going to put a solar installation on it. Then all of a sudden things really matter in a different way than they did before. Of course, we would have no knowledge of that. So like there's a lot of this kind of conversation that you just have to have. It's very, very, very low level and you have to have it directly with these people. So I would say you have to be implanted. Like you basically have to be implanted with these companies in whatever way you can, and you have to fight to do that.
So it sounds like the first order is picking the right customers as development partners.
They'll tell you. I mean, you'll know. 80% of the customer support calls, the people are probably pissed. right? Just by the nature of it. But 20% of the time, they have a problem, but they're like super into AI, and they're like, yeah, like I like want to help. Those are development partners. You'll see it.
That makes tons of sense. It sounds like part of that also is the frequency, depth of communication, and the rapid iteration.
Yeah, it's a core task. I mean, it's a core task of customer support every day.
Yeah. So Jahan, the frontier labs keep getting more and more capable, faster and more extraordinary than any of us predicted, certainly more than I predicted. Where does that curve stop working in your favor? And how can it work against you as a startup? I'm just thinking, like, how do you draw the line between someday do the frontier labs offer what you guys do for free? And how do you think about how to always separate out what part you create versus what the frontier labs do in the background?
It is accelerating. I don't think it will stop accelerating. I mean, I don't know how philosophical a conversation you want us to get into. I do think these things are on a pretty straight line to surpassing human comprehension. That's its own problem. I mean, we'll get there when we get there. For us, inevitably, anything that's purely software, I think will be done by the model itself within 36 months. I don't see any other way around that. And it's a very unpredictable situation. What I would say though is like, even now, right? Like you could look at what we've accomplished so far as a piece of software, but like even now, just by fighting through this, it's very clear that things are emerging that no matter what happens, a frontier lab can't do. Like, for example, we need real-time commodity pricing for all materials. We need like these robust data sets that are changing every single day about what the prices actually are in every county in the world. Basically, we need on-site photography. You need sensors in the field. You need to be able to collect the notes, and you need a rapid-fire collaboration between field and estimation. Eventually, we will get into logistics and these kinds of things and kind of take a more real-world flavor into it. So I think from our perspective, you have to keep moving. No AI company is safe ever. You have to keep going. The models will eat everything in software that it's possible to eat. That's inevitable, but that won't change the nature of network effect. It won't change the network of economies of scale. It won't change the nature of economies of scale. It won't change the nature of distribution. So for us, like, we have a vision on the other side of it. If you can make it 100 times easier to build something, and the way you do that is by having crystal clear communication of the on-site, like conditions on the ground, to effectively a super intelligence, to conditions on the ground at all local warehouses, and you understand how to like the logistics and supply chains and all that stuff, you're going to end up in a very powerful position, right? You're just going to end up in a powerful position. The question is, how do you earn the right to keep doing that? Now, I do think if you take the opposite approach, and if we were just like, okay, we basically like have started to get AI estimation to work, that's it, I think that would end up disintegrating over time. So I think it's facing everyone. I mean, the real question is like, how big do you think the foundation models really get in this world? They're going to be super intelligent. There's no question about it.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I think a little bit of, perhaps as you were alluding to before, that last mile, in terms of owning the customer relationships and the network, the virality, the workflows, your discussion about sort of the tribal knowledge and what you capture and infuse in your product. And I think one question there is, are you operating going forward where that knowledge is retained within the XBuild area of expertise, or is there a fear ever that knowledge is getting sucked back into the core LLMs that you're using as well?
I mean, this is where you get into various philosophical things. Like for us, there is tribal knowledge. So we have a layer of it, but even the customers themselves, they don't want to share. They have knowledge they don't want to share with us, right? So they have their own layer on top of that, and they have their own customizability and this kind of thing, and that's very important to them. So all of that is preserved. But I do want to represent, like, I don't think even thinking about it that way, I don't think is right because okay, so imagine this, like it's not going to have tribal knowledge, but it is going to have read the textbook on how to build XYZ structure. And so it will do that. I always tell the story. I was a computer engineer in college. And so as a result, unfortunately enough, I had to take one kind of like quantum mechanics class as a result of this. And I vividly remember one of my friends who was just unbelievably intelligent would sit there. He wouldn't pay attention to anything in this quantum mechanics class. He wouldn't pay attention. And, I was like taking notes all day, trying to understand this stuff. And before the test, he would just sit and read the textbook. Like, oh, okay, I see. Take the triple integral. Okay, that makes sense. And then he would just ace the test. And that would be that. That's what these things are going to be like. So the question is, like, I understand. I mean, tribal knowledge itself, it's interesting, but even that is going to go out the window when these things are that smart, right? I ultimately do think it becomes about like real tangible network effects, real tangible data sets, real tangible economies of scale, right? Economies of scale will not go away. And that's ultimately where I think you have to triangulate to.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to come back to vibe coding for a moment, because I think it's just so profound. It's pretty, we've observed that, our companies now almost across the board are doing exclusive vibe coding.
Yeah.
How has it impacted XBuild more, let's say, in the last 6 months versus a year ago? And how does that impact, for example, the number of additional engineers you think you need to hire?
It's the most profound change to anything, really. I think it's the most profound disruption I've ever experienced in my life across any topic. It has to be. I think we're still learning, right? We're still learning. I don't think anyone who says they've got it figured out it doesn't. But I would say every engineer is approximately as productive as 10 engineers 2 years ago. That just is true. I would say a product manager can be used as an engineer. A designer can be used as an engineer. Even like a kind of an ambitious marketing person can be used as an engineer, like a junior engineer at this point. So it's just the nature of the entire thing has changed. To me, the way I've tried to adapt to it is we use Claude Code. So first of all, we establish a budget for token usage. And kind of my expectation is that those tokens are used. My preference is they're used even to the point of, okay, if you think you don't have to use it, go do something else and use the credits, because it's not a virtue to save money on this. You need to spend it.
This must translate to, what percentage fewer engineers do you think you'll need as a consequence of this monumental shift? 75% fewer engineers, for instance? I'm just trying to get a sense of what you think
I
the
see.
scale.
Well, it's hard to answer that question statically because everything gets pushed to the edge in capitalism, right? So like, I'll say it this way, for a given scope of work, we would need 15% the engineers.
Okay.
But the aspiration is to push the scale of ambition, right? So like, for example, like we've, even since Opus 4.6 came out, we've like massively overhauled our roadmap. And I suspect every time a new foundation, like the next gen model comes out, that will just accelerate. So that to us, we're constantly trying to find the edge of it. And you'll see, we're about to release like a native app suite that has a lot of really interesting features in it. But this entire idea came about purely because we understood, like, oh my God, like now that this new model is out, it's like we can do 3 times as much as we thought we could. And like, okay, now what, right?
I think for so long, engineering output has been the constraint. And now I think we're moving to a new paradigm where that is no longer the constraint, and the constraint may be market absorption. How fast can customers adopt and absorb new features?
Yeah.
All the other pieces of the pipeline.
Yeah, I think market absorption. One of the things we're actually seeing is, and I'm curious, like as these things get very intelligent beyond human intelligence, just a human's ability to understand what the thing can actually do is itself a limiting factor. Frequently we have customers, they can't use the product because they can't even believe the way you use it is possible. Like that itself is kind of an interesting limiting factor that's going to emerge.
Just going back to the kind of XBuild market segment specifically for a moment, in light of all this and the monumental change you're bringing to the industry in which you're operating, what do you think a construction or roofing company looks like operationally in 10 years? Where, from sort of a back office and administration perspective, do you think humans will be needed? Do you think that we'll get to a point where 99% of the labor is actually doing the work in terms of the human side?
A construction company, you'll be able to run it from your phone, I think. You'll be able to scope it, sell the project, get the permits, get the financing, line up and schedule labor from a cell phone. Yeah.
Which is to say the human labor ultimately will be focused on doing the actual construction or roofing work and nothing else.
Possibly. That is possible. I suspect these things will move to the edge, right? In the same way, it's like, okay, in some theoretical way, like we don't need as many engineers as we did, but that's not actually what happened. We pushed it to the edge, right? So I don't know how long that will persist, but that's what I suspect will happen. Like I suspect it will not be implausible that 3 people can run $250 million of construction projects from a cell phone in 6 years, something like that.
Sam Altman always talks about the, one-man billion-dollar company. And I think this is an example of that same vision.
Yeah. I mean, it is crazy. I don't know what else to say. It's like Star Trek.
Yeah, it is. It's exciting, fantastical, and everything else at the same time. Jahan, we like to end these episodes with some rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Sure.
What's a piece of advice you got from an investor that turned out to be completely dead wrong?
Okay, so the worst piece of advice I've ever gotten in my life, I will say, comes from one of the investors I have the most respect for in the world. But it was, I think you should differentiate from Uber by letting the riders pick which driver they want based on their personality, which we actually tried, and it was absolute failure. But that is a profoundly incorrect piece of advice from one of the most successful venture capitalists in the world. So there you go.
Everyone makes mistakes. Okay, moving on. What's one tool or habit that makes you a better CEO that has nothing to do with technology?
Okay, I would say I play the guitar as a hobby. I'm not incredible at it or anything, but I would say that actually really helps, and it helps because it keeps you extremely grounded in the fact that like random skills that you don't fully understand are insanely difficult to master. And if you're the CEO, especially if you're CEO of a tech company, what you're always trying to do is build space for people who have mastery of these skills to work in a clean and not chaotic environment.
So when you encounter that big problem, you move to a D chord and all is good?
Yeah. Yeah. Or I just, get out of there. Just leave it to the experts.
So I sometimes in a difficult Zoom meeting, I'll put the camera on mute and go bang a few piano notes on my keyboard in the background you can't see here. So
That's awesome.
Have perspective. And this actually relates a little bit to my final rapid fire question for you here, which is, what is the hardest thing to explain to a non-founder about what building a company actually feels like?
The hardest thing to explain to a non-founder about what building a company is like is a company is not real. It is not a real thing, right? There is a bank account, and the goal is the bank account doesn't go to zero, and it eventually goes as close to infinity as possible, right? And there are kind of people sitting around choosing, like the company becomes more real as more people choose to spend their time on the company. That's it. But at the end of the day, kind of the stress-inducing thing about it is you're always engaged in this, what feels like a very tenuous fiction of like, okay, I'm just going to stand here and pretend this is a real thing until ultimately it becomes a real thing. And eventually, like if you do enough experimentation and if you are persistent enough, something works and then other people join you and it's a snowballing effect. But it's at the early days, especially like seed, Series A, I mean, it really is just people sitting around doing almost like just fooling around on something entirely fake.
Sometimes I think of CEOs in their early stages as like the leaders of a cult.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you have blind faith in something and you have to convince others to believe the religion
Correct.
And the core promise and vision.
I try to avoid that stuff. Although, Travis was incredible. It's just unbelievable at that.
Cool. Well, amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, Jahan. We're so excited to see what's next for you and XBuild. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me, and you'll hear from us soon.